right. So good evening, everybody. Good evening. Oh, that was terrible. I think you can do better than that. Good evening. There we go. That's much better. Excellent. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out tonight. I know it's a bit chilly, a bit chillier than we were expecting, but thanks, everybody, for coming out here tonight. And welcome. I see many returning faces, so hello to everybody that I already know. I also see a few new faces here today, so welcome to all of you. For anyone who does not know who I am, my name is Alexandra Elliott. I'm the curator here at Quincy Historical Society, and I will be your speaker this evening. So as you probably already know, we are going to be talking about women's history here tonight, because this is Women's History Month. And I did title this program Beyond Abigail. Now, I know I'm being a little bit cheeky with that title. We love Abigail here in Quincy. Of course we do. She is a remarkable woman, an incredible historical figure, and all of her work and her letters are just such a treasure trove for what I do here today. However, Abigail is a big star, and sometimes her light can obscure the light of many, many other stars that we have here in Quincy history and all of the other remarkable women who deserve just a little bit of attention. And so the goal here tonight is to try and provide a little bit more attention to all of those other shining stars in Quincy history. So we're going to be talking about a number of different individuals. And honestly, this is one of the things that I personally love about Quincy history, and that is that any one of these individual women that I'm going to talk about here tonight could be the center of an entire town's or community's historic focus. But Quincy, we have a million of them. We're very, very lucky here in Quincy with the amount of history that we have. So it makes my job certainly much more fun because of that. So I feel very lucky to be able to work in this community, and I'm very delighted to be able to bring you a few stories here today about some lesser known Quincy women. One caveat before we start is that this is not a comprehensive list of every notable Quincy woman. That would probably take me 3 or 4 days, and I assume that you have other places that you need to be. So we're not going to do a comprehensive list. In fact, if I've forgotten someone that you think deserved to be in this presentation here tonight, please come up after the program and let me know. I'd love to talk about it and potentially incorporate them into something else that we're doing as time goes on. Anything else that I want to talk about before we get started? Nope, I think we are ready to go. All right. So as we begin, how do you go about talking about a long list of women without just making it be name, date, they did this other thing, and then move on and keep going? So I tried to organize it, first of all, chronologically for a little bit of this history, and then to go thematically as well. So these are 6 of the different sectors that I will be exploring in this program. So that includes Quincy women in public office, in public service, in academia, in business, in sports, and in the arts. Again, like I said, this is not comprehensive, but we've got at least one individual featured in each of these segments. And honestly, quite a few of these women could actually be across a whole number of different themes as well. Many of them had multiple different talents and could really be classified in a number of different ways. So moving on to the first group here. So starting off chronologically, I'm going way back, all the way back to before there was even a Quincy, before there was an Old Braintree, before there was a Mount Wollaston. So going back to the pre-colonial period and talking a little bit about Native American history. And Native American history is extremely complicated, and there's a number of reasons for that. One of them being that the only primary sources we have when it comes to Native American history tends to be sources that were written by English settlers. Now, they tend to be a bit biased with the prejudices that the settlers had at the time, but then also, depending on who those English settlers were speaking to, they're getting contradictory information from various different tribes and individuals. One of the good examples of that is actually who had more control over Massachusetts. Was it the Massachusetts tribe or was it the Wampanoag tribe? To this day, it is very hotly debated between these two tribes who actually was subservient to whom and at what point. So this is something that you run into a lot when you get into Native American history, because a lot of these tribes did not write things down, especially here in the Northeast. They didn't have a written record, so we don't have many primary sources from their own perspective. So we're going off of what mostly the English settlers had to say about the Native Americans, and then also what we've been able to glean archaeologically. So I want to talk a little bit broadly about who were the native population that lived here in what we now call Quincy. So in Quincy, the main group of Native Americans were known as the Massachusetts tribe. Their borders, as I already mentioned, were ill-defined. They probably changed over the years, and whether or not they actually had control over this area for a significant length of time is debated. But by the time of English settlers showing up in around 1625, the main group that was in this area are known as the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts tribe, and their leader was the great sachem Chickatawbut. So he had his main summer seat at Mosswatuset Hummock, which is at the northern end of Wollaston Beach. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. And so that was one of their main settlements in this area. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of women in Algonquin culture. And I say Algonquin culture because the Massachusetts were the Algonquin-speaking historical nation. And gender roles were a little bit less strictly defined in Algonquin-speaking cultures than they were for the English settlers. Both men and women participated in farming practices, fishing, crafting, all sorts. It was a little bit more egalitarian, but not completely so. One of the ways in which it wasn't was that women were very rarely in positions of power, but it did happen. There are at least 3 female leaders in southern New England that we know of, and one of them I will talk about in just a moment. Now, one other interesting feature is that women's names are very rarely recorded in Native American history, at least when it comes to the Massachusetts tribe and to these Algonquin-speaking groups. And that is because it was considered disrespectful to address a woman by her given name if you were not a member of her tribe or her immediate family. So they were often referred to by honorific titles instead of by their first names. So what this means is that we don't know the names of a lot of the important women that existed in the Massachusetts tribe. So one of the women that I do want to talk about here today has to do with, as I said, I mentioned Chickatawbut. He was the great sachem of the Massachusetts. And the reason why his summer seat may have been here in what is now Quincy is because it is believed that his mother was born here. It is believed that she was buried near Passamaquoddy, or what is known as Broad Meadows, and that it might have been through his matrilineal line that he actually rose to power. There are also primary sources that claim that Chickatawbut directly answered to a female leader. So this was a woman who was referred to in the primary documents as the squaw sachem of Mystic. So Mystic referring to the Mystic River up north of the Charles River. Now I do want to talk for a moment about the term squaw, and that is a Algonquin word which essentially translates to honored woman, and is roughly equivalent in English to a term like madam or ma'am. Or actually, the best example that I can think of would be the term goody or good wife, from if you're reading The Crucible or Nathaniel Hawthorne stories, and you're hearing about Goody Bishop or Goody Proctor. This just meant like honored wife or revered woman. And so the word squaw in the Algonquin language just means an honorable woman. So that is the rough equivalent. Now that was a term that was appropriated by European and American settlers and was used as a slur, especially against non-Algonquin speaking tribes as American settlement out west continued. And there is an effort currently ongoing by various Algonquin speaking groups, including the Massachusetts tribes that still exist today, and the Wampanoag, to reclaim this word because it is part of their language and they are trying to keep their language or revive their language as much as possible. So something to keep in mind as I continue to use this term. So the squaw sachem of Mystic, she was the widow of another great sachem, Nanepeshemet, she ruled the area north of Boston, so kind of north of the Charles River, around the Mystic River, out west towards Natick, and then Revere and up towards Revere and Lynn as well. And she ruled jointly with her 3 sons. Now, she is credited with having deeded the town, or the area that is now Cambridge, Watertown, Medford, etc., to the English. And there's at least one record that suggests that when Chickatawbut was starting to trade and make deals with the English settlers, that in order to do so, he had to speak to the squaw sachem before he could agree to anything. But that's just one primary source, and I haven't been able to find any other corroborating evidence, but interesting if it is in fact the case. Moving along. Oh, actually, one quick thing just on the slides here. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, that is a flagstaff that is, I believe, in Medford? No, excuse me, Arlington. Yes, thank you. That's my cheat sheet on the screen there. So in Arlington, Massachusetts, there is a flagstaff that does have a depiction of her at the base. And of course, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see an image of Mount Wollaston, which was where the first English settlement or trading post was set up, and also where it is, or close to where it is believed where Chickatawbut's mother may have been buried. So moving along into the colonial period. Now, I have to be very careful here because this is about Anne Hutchinson. And Anne Hutchinson is quite possibly my favorite Quincy woman in history. I love Anne Hutchinson. I can and will go on about her forever. So I'm going to try and stick to my notes here and not take up too much of the time just talking about Anne Hutchinson here tonight. But who was Anne Hutchinson? She was a religious teacher, and she was also an early settler of Massachusetts and a very devout Puritan. She is popularly referred to as the American Joan of Arc, which kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what her story is going to be like. One of the reasons why I really love her has to do with some of my theories about why the American Revolution had to start here in Massachusetts. And really, the intellectual seeds of the revolution are here in Quincy. And I believe, or there is an argument to be made that it was Anne Hutchinson who planted those seeds, and that rebellious nature and that rebellious story actually started with her and really just never left Quincy. So who is Anne Hutchinson? She was born in the late 1500s. She is the daughter of an Anglican minister, but this is before the split of the Puritans off from the Anglican Church. And she is remarkably well educated for a woman at her time. Traditionally, women were not educated, but one interesting thing about the Puritans is that there was a tenet within their religion that everybody, boys and girls, had to be able to read and write, at least in a basic sense, because you had to be able to read your Bible to thus be able to understand what it said for yourself. So boys and girls in the Puritan church were educated up to a basic level. But Anne was even more well educated than that because her father was a minister, and he believed that his girls should be just as well educated as his boys, and so he taught her theology, and she could argue and discuss theology as well as anybody else in the community. Now, I should also define what is a Puritan. This is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot, but very few people actually, ever define it. So a Puritan is essentially a radical subset of the Anglican Church. So these are people who thought that after the Protestant Reformation in England, that the Anglican Church was still way too Catholic, and thus they wanted to purify it. And so they wanted to strip it of various ceremonies, various holidays, and get down to something that was a little much stricter and much more basic. One thing that they believed in that is crucial to think of when I'm talking about this is the concept of predestination, which is that the Puritans believed that God had already decided who was going to heaven and who wasn't, and that they also believed that whatever happens in your life or whatever goes on in your life in this earthly realm really didn't matter. All that matters is getting into heaven. So this explains why they didn't like things like plays or dancing or anything fun, really. The only fun thing that they allowed people to do was drink, but that was mostly to do with the quality of the water as opposed to anything else. Now, another interesting thing about Puritan culture is that they allowed non-ministers to essentially hold Bible studies in their homes in between, the Sunday Sabbath. And these were often led by women. So women were allowed to have a small amount of power within these communities by leading these Bible studies, and Anne Hutchinson absolutely did this herself. And she was known for having very large meetings because she could argue theology as well as any of the ministers could. So she was a very popular person for this. Her husband, William Hutchinson, was a wealthy textile merchant, and when she and her husband arrived in Boston in 1634, they built one of the largest and grandest houses in Boston at the time. It was located down in downtown Crossing, what is now what was once the old corner bookshop, and is now a Chipotle. They were also granted one of the largest land grants in the Mount Wollaston settlement. So in Quincy, they got one of the biggest parcels of land when they came out here. So they had their very lovely townhouse, and they had their very lovely country estate as well. So one of the interesting things about why Anne Hutchinson came over here is because she was a follower of a Puritan minister known as John Cotton. She was also the sister-in-law of another minister who was the minister for the North Precinct who was the minister for the Mount Wollaston parish, that being Reverend John Wheelwright. Both of these men would eventually be accused of being what are called antinomians, which is a really, really long explanation, but it boils down to people thought they were anarchists. They were not. Now, when I get into talking about Anne Hutchinson, I have to start talking about the minutiae of Puritan theology, and it gets really complicated really quickly. In fact, my favorite quote about this antinomian controversy, the Anne Hutchinson controversy, comes from Charles Francis Adams in his book, 3 Episodes of Massachusetts History. Not only were the points in dispute obscure, but the discussion was carried on in a jargon which has become unintelligible, and from a theological point of view, it is now devoid of interest. So it's largely unimportant to actually what they were arguing over, but you're going to have to trust me when I say that this wasn't existential to the existence of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were really upset about all of this. The dispute boils down to, it was, how do you know that you have God's favor in the Puritan Church? There were 2 ways in which the Puritan ministers said that you could discover that you have God's favor. One was through the covenant of works, which is basically how closely you adhere to all of the very detailed and strict social rules of the Puritan setup. So like wearing certain colors only if you work in certain professions, and making sure that you always go to the services on Sunday, and just making sure that you stay in the lines socially. The other way that you could be sure that you had God's grace was through the covenant of grace. And that is basically boils down to a feeling in your heart that you are a good person. These things can be contradictory. If you are seriously interested in Anne Hutchinson after this talk, I highly recommend a blog post that I wrote about it on our blog, the Quincy History blog, so you can absolutely learn more about her. I dive a little bit more into this theology and explain it a little bit more in depth. But just for tonight, we're going to leave it at that. Basically what happens with the antinomian controversy is that Reverend Cotton and Reverend Wheelwright preached that the covenant of grace were more important than the covenant of works. And so that you should still follow the covenant of works and still follow the rules, but really it's what is in your heart that matters. This, like I said, is an existential crisis for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Cotton and Wheelwright are immediately thrust into a world of legal trouble over this. Cotton immediately recants and walks his beliefs back. Reverend Wheelwright did not. He doubles down, and he ends up getting banished immediately. Meanwhile, Anne Hutchinson, the main character of the story, was continuing to lead her Bible studies and continuing to preach. Grace was more important than the covenant of works, which of course the local ministers did not appreciate. And also she was pointing out that the ministers were preaching about the covenant of works. Well, they're all hypocrites anyway, so she got in trouble pretty quickly. So she's put on trial, and ultimately she is banished for her beliefs. She refuses to recant them. and found the colony of Rhode Island, and eventually has to move down to the Bronx and to New York, and ends up being killed in a Native American raid on her home in that area. So it's a very sad end to her story, but her line continues on. In fact, the royal governor of Massachusetts during the Revolution, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, is her grandson through her 14 children. Yes. So Anne Hutchinson, like I said, she is absolutely one of my favorite characters in history, much less in including Quincy history. You know, she has a real voice of her own, and it shines through in her trial testimony. She knows what she believes to be true, and she really sticks to her guns, and that's worth remembering her about that. I think we should maybe talk a little bit about the Quincy family, because the Quincy family is obviously quite important in Quincy history, being the family that the city is named after. Quincy family, goes all the way back to these first settlers, but we've got a number of significant women in the Quincy family as well, two of them being the Dorothys. Now, of course, I'm sure that you are all aware of the Dorothy Quincy homestead that we have just up the street, the beautiful historic house museum that we have. Well, did you know that there's more than one Dorothy Q? Well, now you do. So there are, I think there's actually more than two, but I'm only going to talk about two of the Dorothy Qs here tonight. The first one is Dorothy Quincy Jackson, and she was a very, very early, born in around 1700. And she is the person for whom the poem Dorothy Q was written by her grandson, or great-great-great-grandson, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in 1871. And so to talk to you a little, or to quote from that poem a little bit, he's actually writing about this portrait that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. O damsel Dorothy, Dorothy Q, strange is the gift that I owe to you, such a gift as never a king, save to a daughter or son might bring. All my tenure of heart and hand, all my title of house and land, mother and sister and child and wife, and joy and sorrow and death and life. What if 100 years ago those close shut lips had answered no, when forth the tremulous question came that cost the maiden her Norman name. And under the folds that look so still, the bodice swelled and the bosoms thrill. Should I be I, or would it be 1/10 another and 9/10 me? So he is reflecting back upon how the whims of fate and the whims of this very young woman, when she's proposed to and when she said yes to her particular husband, has resulted in him being where he was that day. So it's a very nice poem, kind of tying into genealogy and all the things that we're interested in here. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the other Dorothy Q, that being Dorothy Quincy Hancock. And of course, she is most famous for being the First Lady of Massachusetts and the wife of the founding father, John Hancock, and another. And John Hancock, of course, he was born on a house that was once on this site, in fact. So Dorothy Quincy Hancock grew up at the Dorothy Quincy homestead until about the age of 10, I believe. But the family ended up having to leave the house for financial reasons. And so when she began courting, unfortunately, she probably did not meet with John Hancock in the house itself, as the rumor often gets spread. So I'm very sorry to have to quash that here tonight. But the truth of it is that she probably would not have been in that house at that time. What's interesting, actually, is that we don't know a lot about her marriage, or really much at all about her life. She doesn't write very much. Unlike Abigail, she doesn't write too many letters. She doesn't keep a diary. In fact, we have letters from John Hancock writing to her saying, could you write to me more often than you do? She has a very sad life, from what we do know. She and John had 2 children, neither of whom survive into adulthood. And she does seem to have gone into her marriage with open eyes when she marries John Hancock. He was literally a wanted man. He literally has a price on his head. And she is definitely a very strong-willed woman. Before their marriage, Dorothy's father was very ill, and she was down with John Hancock, I believe in Connecticut at the time. And as they're preparing to get married, and she insists on traveling back to Quincy to see him and take care of him, before the worst should happen and go back to Braintree. And Hancock says, it's too dangerous, you can't travel alone, you're, connected to me, you're gonna get in trouble. And she says, "You are not yet my master, sir, I will go where I wish." So she's a very interesting lady. All right, so I am going to talk about at least one Adams woman here tonight, and that being Louisa Catherine Adams. She often does not get as much attention as I feel that she should. In fact, I've started diving into more of her writings recently, and I've really found that she is, quite remarkable and quite noteworthy in a way that, she doesn't get enough credit for. Abigail obviously gets a lot of notice for being a tremendous writer, and she absolutely is, but Louisa Catherine is notable in a slightly different way, so let me talk a little bit about that. So Louisa Catherine Adams, she's most famous for being the first foreign-born First Lady and the wife of the 6th President, John Quincy Adams. Quite honestly, the fact that John Quincy Adams ever won an election is probably in no small part due to Louisa Catherine. She was known for being an excellent hostess. She was known for being extremely charming, and John Quincy Adams was not. So she was definitely knew how to work a room, as they say. So she was born in London to a very wealthy merchant family. Her father was American, I believe from Maryland, and politically he was in favor of the revolution, despite him living in London. So at various points he had to go back to America for a while and before he could resume his business back in London because of his patriotic sympathies. But Louisa grew up in British high society. She had the best of the best of the best in her upbringing. Because of this, she knew how to walk in the halls of power and how to move through them gracefully and how to win people over. So she could go into a royal court and behave appropriately. She could walk into a tea room and make sure and charm all the other people that are in it. She was excellent at the sort of drawing room politics, shall we say. So her marriage to John Quincy Adams was a little bit less the stuff of legends as the relationship between John Adams and Abigail Adams. Louisa's family was on the verge of bankruptcy when they got married, and it's not clear whether or not Adams actually knew that when they got married, and so her dowry never got paid because the family had to declare bankruptcy like a day or two or a few weeks after they got married. So this was an early strain on their marriage. Abigail also was very much against the match. She thought that Louisa was a little bit too delicate to be the wife of a hardy New Englander, and that she wouldn't, survive here in our very harsh New England winters as we are experiencing right at the moment. There's, however, a lot of evidence that John Quincy Adams had quite a bit of affection for Louisa. Their letters at points get quite steamy, in fact. And he's often writing her love poems as well. So there is quite a lot of affection between the two of them, even though there are very rocky patches. But John Quincy Adams also leaves her alone quite often and leaves her isolated in ways like he'll be going off, I have to go take care of, I have to go, negotiate the end of this war, darling. I'm leaving you here by yourself in a country that you don't know anyone in. So that happens a few times over the course of their marriage. And Louisa does frequently struggle with illnesses, possibly even depression. This might have something to do with the fact that she was pregnant 14 times. Unfortunately, she does suffer from multiple miscarriages. I think the count is up to 9. She suffers through a stillbirth, and not to mention the death of their infant daughter in Russia. And 2 of their older sons as well die tragically when they are adults. So she has a lot of tragedy in her life, and the Adamses generally do as well. But there's also evidence, or there isn't much evidence to suggest that John Quincy Adams relied on Louisa's advice nearly as much as John did on Abigail. And quite honestly, I would say that would be to his detriment. What we see in her writings is that Louisa is a tremendous judge of character. She can see through people extremely well, and then when she writes about them in her diaries or in her letters, she's an extremely adept observer of people. She's describing them. She's able to parse out their motivations. She knows exactly what they're looking for or whatever nefarious schemes that they have going on. She's extremely adept at understanding people. She's also extremely clear-eyed with regards to the Republic. The Adamses, John, Abigail, John Quincy, tend to be very starry-eyed and have big ideals and have a very optimistic view of how everything was working out. And Louisa Catherine, in her journal, she says often, I would never say this to my husband, but things aren't going as well as he thinks they are. So one quote that I do want to take out from her diary, though, is actually an observation that she makes about John Quincy Adams to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So this was something that she wrote in her journal on March 12th in 1820, while John Quincy Adams was still the Secretary of State. I have seen too much of public life not to value it for what it is worth. I think, however, I know my husband's character, and with the conviction that his habits and tastes are fixed beyond the possibility of change, I fear that he could not live long out of an active sphere of public life, and that it is absolutely essential to his existence. So John Quincy, in his diaries, often gets frustrated, and it says something like, once this commission is over, once this task is over, I quit, I'm getting out of here, I'm retiring from public life and letting the chips fall where they do, and he never does. He always goes back. There's always, up until his death, he literally has a stroke, I believe, on the House chamber floor while he is fighting against the American involvement in the war in Texas. So so he is. she has his number pretty accurately. So that is Louisa, and I think that a little bit more love for Louisa would be a good idea. So moving on to a little bit, again, talking about some of the great families of Quincy, and talking about how they've, various women over the years have dealt with the dynastic legacies that have come up over the years. So starting off on the left-hand side of the screen, we have Eliza Susan Quincy. So of course she is a scion of the Quincy family. She is the daughter of Josiah Quincy III, the great mayor for whom Quincy Market is named, great mayor of Boston. He's also the president of Harvard at a time. And she's the granddaughter of Josiah Quincy Jr., who is the patriot. So he was the co-counsel with John Adams on the Boston Massacre trial case. So she is one of 5 sisters, and their great-grandnephew called them the Articulate Sisters because of their ability to write. And so on the screen there you see the title page from the Articulate Sisters, which their great-grandnephew wrote about his great-aunts. She's an artist. She mostly does monochrome landscapes. We actually don't have any images of her, so I just had some of her painting there in the background. These are actually a fantastic resource for the pre-industrial historic homes in Quincy, because she manages to capture them before anything else is built up around them. So there's one of them, it's the only record we have of the original Quincy homestead. So before the Dorothy Quincy house was built, the original homestead that was on that property, because it got torn down, and so this is all we have left is from her paintings. She was also very invested in curating the legacy of her family. So she edited, or helped to edit, the papers of Josiah Quincy Jr. and also wrote his first biography. However, during her life, or at least at first, she did not want to claim credit for this work. She said that it was her father who did that, not herself, and that she didn't have anything to do with it. And she also likely did this with her father's papers and his biography, which she then credited to her brother. But it wasn't until the 2nd or 3rd edition came out of these papers that it was said that, no, it really was Eliza Susan that was involved with curating all of these papers. So she was a remarkably talented woman, but she felt that she needed to keep a lid on that talent. And she was apparently a very big fan of Jane Austen, and corresponded with Austen's brother, however, never really took it into her head to write a novel for herself, even though she probably could have. By all accounts, it seems that she was very comfortable being, remaining within the social spheres that were allowed to women at the time, and that she didn't feel the need to stray beyond that. And that's where she was most comfortable. On the other hand, and on the other side of the screen, we have Abigail Adams Homans. So this was the member of I believe the 5th generation of the Adams family. probably the end of the line of the really famous Adamses. She was the daughter of John Quincy Adams II and the granddaughter of Charles Francis Adams, who was the diplomat to Britain during the Civil War. She grew up in Quincy, and her father died when she was very young, so she was raised largely by her uncles, Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was actually the founder of the Quincy Historical Society, Brooks Adams, and Henry Adams, who were both writers and artists in their own sense. So she did write a book about this experience, An Education by Uncles, and I have the title page for that up on the screen as well, where she writes very irreverently but affectionately about her take on the family and on its legacy. For example, she talks about a time that her uncle Brooks Adams took her to Paris and then ditched her there in a convent while he went back to fight in the Spanish-American War. And he just left her there. And she starts the book off basically by saying, "The Quincy in which I grew up is dead as a dodo." And she implies that this was actually a good thing, that it was changing and that it was evolving and becoming something more dynamic and bigger and better. She eventually moves to Boston when she's married, really truly becomes like a Boston Brahmin. She's known for being quite no-nonsense, blunt and sassy. And there's one story from her obituary, which involves her going to, or in the middle of a blizzard, she's traveling through Back Bay, and the blizzard is so bad she stops at the Somerset Club, at which her husband is a member. It's a very elite and prestigious social club. And she's saying, like, it's so cold, the weather's so bad, I can't continue on, so can I get a room? Can you make up a room for me? And the people at the desk say, well, no, you're a woman traveling by yourself. We can't, even if your husband's a member, we can't make a room just for you. And she says, okay, well, I'll go get my cab driver then. So she was a bit of a character, as you can tell. Now we get into the portion of the talk where I start approaching things a little bit more thematically. So talking about Quincy women in the political scene. So we're going to start off with Adelaide Claflin. So Adelaide is famous for being the first, or not so much famous, but she's interesting for being the first elected woman to a elected position in Quincy. So she was born in Boston. Her parents both supported her education very heavily. And after high school, she actually managed to get private lessons with Harvard professors, because women were not allowed to attend Harvard at the time, but she got some private tutorials. When she got married in 1870, she and her husband moved to Quincy, where she became very active in the local suffrage movement. And in 1884, she was the first woman to be elected to public office on the school committee. And she served in that position for about 3 years, as well as being very active in many of the other social organizations. Now, what's interesting about her is that we had no idea that she existed for a good amount of time. For a very, very long time, we believed that it was a woman by the name of Mabel Adams, who was also elected to the school committee, who was the first elected woman in Quincy. However, it was one of our board members, Wayne Miller, who also edits our wonderful newsletter, and who dug up Adelaide Claflin's story and took it on and wrote about it in the newsletter. And so we completely revised Quincy history there and rediscovered an important individual. Now, after the time that she stopped being a member of the school committee, she felt called to become a minister, and ended up going to Chicago to the Meadville Theological School for a number of years, where she eventually graduated and became a Unitarian minister until her death in 1931. Now, on the other side of the screen, we have Edna B. Austin, which members may recognize from our latest newsletter. Wayne just wrote a biography of her life in the latest issue. So Edna was born in Maine to an intellectually rigorous family. Apparently, the rule about not talking politics at the dinner table did not apply in her family household. She was an avid outdoorswoman and very accomplished equestrian. Austin and her husband ended up moving to Quincy in the 1920s, as her husband accepted a position at the Quincy Public Schools. She became a lawyer in 1930 and opened a practice down the street on Hancock Street, actually. So she was a lawyer as well as an activist, and again, also very active in the various women's groups in Quincy at the time. She first ran for office in 1934, but came in dead last for city council, so she did not actually win that race. But the second time she ran, in 1943, she won by a landslide and became the first woman elected to the city council in Quincy. She served for 15 years off and on with a gap of about 3 years in the middle there. And in 1954, she became the first chairwoman of the city council as well. And then eventually retired from politics in 1959. So again, another very accomplished individual. And like I said, if you're interested in hearing more about all of these very interesting individuals in Quincy history, I recommend becoming a member so that you can receive our newsletter. It is wonderful. So Quincy Women in Public Service. These are also two of my favorite women in Quincy history, I will be honest, especially the first one that I'm going to talk about, Molly Dewson, or Mary Dewson. She preferred going by Molly, so I'm going to refer to her as such. So Molly Dewson was born in Quincy and attended the Dana Hall School and Wellesley College. She began her career as a social worker, advocating for women's rights, labor reform, education, and also reform within the criminal justice system. And it was through this work that she met her lifelong partner, Mary, also known as Polly Porter, during this phase of her life. So both women became involved in the suffrage movement during the final push to pass the 19th Amendment. And after serving with the Red Cross in World War I, Dewson moved to New York and began getting heavily involved in the social working scene and social causes down there. And that was how she became acquainted with a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, she was highly active in the New York Democratic Party and worked to get women placed in the FDR administration, including Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet secretary, as the Secretary of Labor, whom you may have come to the performance by one of our regulars, Janet Parnes, who did a performance about the life of Frances Perkins for us a few months ago. Now, Dewson was crucial and considered crucial. In fact, FDR used to call her the Little General because of how organized and dogged she was about getting things done. So she was crucial in the education campaigns around the New Deal, specifically in teaching women how to apply for the various programs that were being debuted during this period. Eventually, she was named to the Social Security Board and oversaw the reorganization of that word I'm looking for is the institution, and made that program more efficient. She left public life in 1938 due to an illness and ended up in her retirement splitting her time between New York and Maine for the remainder of her life. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, we have Mary Parker Follett. This is someone who is not very well known, except if you are very heavy in the management theory academia. So a few years ago, actually, Ed told me a story about a woman who visited all the way from Ireland and was appalled to find out that that our museum was not just dedicated to Mary Parker Follett. A bit of a niche request, but we're working on it. So Mary Parker Follett, she was also a social worker, but she was also a philosopher in the area of business and organizational management. So I have not read any of her books, but from what I gather of her philosophy and of her work is that it has to do with institutional organization and how leaders within that can, get the best result from that. And apparently this revolutionized how management was done in the country. So she was born in Quincy to a wealthy family. She attended Thayer Academy, Cambridge University, Radcliffe College, and eventually Harvard when they started admitting women. And while attending college, she met the woman who would become her life partner by the name of Isabel Briggs. She was tapped by President Theodore Roosevelt to be his personal consultant on managing nonprofit, non-governmental, and volunteer organizations, so she had the ear of a president. She wrote a number of books on the subject of management, And just to kind of give you a taste of what her philosophy was like, I've got a quote here for you. So this is from her book, The Creative Experience from 1924. Leadership is not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those led. The most essential work of the leader is to create more leaders. So there you have it. Moving on to academia. So we have two women here who were very influential in academia, or certainly interesting within academia. So first off, we have a woman by the name of Alice Bach Gould. She was a mathematician, a philosopher, and a historian, and she too actually is a descendant of the Quincy family. She was born in Cambridge, but actually grew up, around the Quincy Mansion, which is used to be on the campus of the Eastern Nazarene. She's also spent a good amount of her childhood in South America, which influenced her later career. She attended Radcliffe College, Bryn Mawr, MIT, and Cambridge University. And mainly she was interested in the sciences and STEM. But she also did quite a bit of extensive research in Spain about the voyages of Columbus and the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Her most influential work in the realm of history included a publication where she tracked down all of Columbus's crew and identified all but 3 of them and figured out their biographies and who they were and where they came from, and actually changed the scholarship on that. It was previously believed that Columbus had just recruited, deserters from the army and just raided the jails and gotten the worst of the worst in criminals. And it turned out that no, these were just regular people and sailors. So she really did change the scholarship on that subject. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have Mary Agnes Reardon. She was born in Quincy, attended Radcliffe and Yale, and she was an artist and an art professor. She's known for being mostly an accomplished liturgical fresco artist and an illustrator for children's books. Her frescoes are located around the country, including quite a few here in Massachusetts, but also in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and St. Louis. She illustrated also, you might recognize it, her most famous illustrated book is called The Snow Treasure from 1942. If you saw unfortunately I didn't grab a picture of the illustrations, but if you saw the illustrations, it probably would look familiar. And then she was also, starting in the 1950s, a professor of art at Emmanuel College. Now in business, we have a number of individuals that I want to talk about. The first 2 are Christiana and Genevieve Lee. So they are accidental entrepreneurs, shall we say. So Christiana Lee was the wife of a man by the name of Joseph Lee. Joseph Lee was an African-American man who was the manager of the Squantum Inn, out in Squantum, of course. And after his death in 1908, the Squantum Inn obviously needed a new manager, but Joseph Lee was one of the most popular fish frying experts in the state. He was also the inventor of 2 revolutionary machines in the food service industry, that being a automatic bread crumbing machine, where you could take stale bread and turn it into breadcrumbs, and then also an automatic dough kneading machine, so you could get like the perfect batch of roll dough every time. So they took these inventions, they took this recipes that he had, and they opened Lee's Inn out in Squantum as well, around the corner from the Squantum Inn. So they opened that in 1909 and continued to run it until Christiana's death in 1916. On the other side of the screen, we have Sherry McCoy. She was the former CEO of Avon Products and Johnson & Johnson. She's also a scientist and an inventor. She owns several patents under her name and was named on the Forbes Top 50 Women in Business. So just a brief little biography there. She is still alive and still with us, in fact, and still continuing to do great things in her industry. But that also brings me to Rose Cherubini. So Rose Cherubini is someone who came onto our radar quite accidentally in the past few years. She's a fashion designer and a business owner. This actually came about because we had an individual come to us and asked me to look into the history of their home and to find out, who had lived there before, who were they, find some information. And as I was doing some digging, I found Rose Cherubini. And it turns out that she is quite an interesting lady. So Rose was born in Somerville in 1913 and started making her own clothes from a very young age. Her uncle was also a dress designer, and so there was quite often a lot of extra fabric sitting around the house. So she would make, just from scraps of fabric, she would whip up a dress and apparently, disappear from her friends, go whip something up, come down, and just to impress her friends. Apparently she also literally made dresses out of the curtain sometimes. In 1934, she was married to Colombo Cherubini, a Quincy native, and who worked in the oil and gas industry here in Quincy. And in 1950, she opened a shop, her first shop on Hancock Street, actually down the street, roughly where the Quincy College building and the President's Place building is today. Over her career, she owned her own shop several times, including here in Quincy a couple times, but also in Boston on Newbury Street and Clarendon Street. She also worked as the official designer for several of Boston's eminent department stores, including Bonwit Teller and Worth's. In addition to her business success, she also had some regional fame. She was commissioned by name by John Glenn's wife to design an orbit dress for after John Glenn successfully came back to Earth. All the parties that she was going to have to attend, she wanted a Rose Cherubini dress. She designed, fitted, and sewed a gown in 2 hours on live television. And she won a competition for creating a dress out of burlap. And apparently her winning entry involved it being a hot pink number. I couldn't find a photograph, unfortunately. Her designs were featured in national, regional, and local fashion shows of all sizes. This includes the local high school, all the way up to the nursing homes, all the way to real established fashion shows all throughout Massachusetts as well. And she continued to do this all the way up until the 1990s. A Boston gallery actually put on an exhibition of her designs in 2013, and so on the right-hand side of the screen you can see the Samson Galleries. That was the exhibit that was put on in 2013, and she lived to a very ripe old age of 102, and finally passing away in 2016. So Rose Cherubini is obviously a very interesting woman. If anybody knows the family, I would love to get in touch with them to see if I can find out more about them. Similarly, I've been meaning to reach out to the Samson Galleries to try and see if I can get in touch with them that way, because she's definitely a very interesting individual. Moving on to sports. So Quincy has quite a bit of sports history, in fact, and quite a few individuals who have been involved in professional sports in varying capacities. So we're going to talk about a couple of the women here tonight. So first up, we have on the left-hand side of the screen, Mildred Wiley. She was an Olympic high jumper, if you can't tell by that picture. She won bronze at the 1928 Summer Olympics in Amsterdam, and apparently she beat her personal best record during that competition, which was 1.56 meters. I don't know, I can't jump that high, so that's pretty good. Another interesting fact about her is that she was also the mother of Bob D., who was a Patriots player. So they were, in fact, related. In the middle of the screen, we have Mary Pratt. She was a pitcher for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which is very famous because a movie was made out about it called A League of Their Own. So if you've seen that movie, that is very much based off of the experiences of women like Mary Pratt. Mary grew up in Quincy and attended Boston University, earning a degree in physical education. She then left Boston, came back to Quincy, and started teaching in Quincy Public Schools in 1941. However, in 1943, she got recruited by the Rockford Peaches out in Illinois, which was, like I said, part of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And she played for them for one season before getting recruited by the Kenosha Comets in Wisconsin, where she led the team to a league championship that year, and including pitching a no-hitter. She retired from baseball in 1947 and returned to Quincy, where she continued to be a physical education teacher at Quincy Public Schools and Braintree Public Schools until roughly 1986. And unfortunately, she died just a few years ago in 2020. And there we go. I was going to say, does anybody know her here? Yes, so we have a few people. Excellent. Yeah, so Mary Pratt, very, very fondly remembered by a lot of people here in Quincy. Then on the right-hand side of the screen, we have Karen Cashman. She is an Olympic speed skater and won the bronze medal at the 1994 Lillehammer Winter Olympics in the 3,000-meter short track relay. So, like I said, we have so many tremendously accomplished sportsmen, sportswomen here in Quincy, and here's just a few of them. So we also have quite a few writers in Quincy history. The first one on the slide that I do want to talk about, this was a woman who has very, very, very recently come to our attention as someone who is actually buried at Mount Wollaston Cemetery. And this is Harriet Wilson. She is an author. She is, in fact, the first African-American to publish a novel in the United States. And she is buried right here in Quincy. She spent her final years here. She didn't spend a lot of time here, but she is, like I said, in Mount Wollaston. Her book is titled Our Nig, or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black. It is semi-autobiographical and goes into some of the details about her own life with some, possibly changes, certainly changes of name, some, dramatization of her own life story. So Harriet Wilson was born in New Hampshire and was actually orphaned at a very young age, and so was then indentured as a servant until her 18th birthday to pay for her upkeep to the Hayward family in New Hampshire. Now, by the accounts that she talks about in her book, she endured some really terrible treatment and conditions, like very abusive behavior from the Hayward family. And after leaving the Haywards, she worked as a domestic servant and as a seamstress. She got married in 1951 and had a child, but her husband actually ran off and abandoned them. So she had to put her child into a poor farm while she worked to support him. And this was actually the point when she wrote her novel. She wrote the book in the attempt, and it says at the very, very end of the book that she was writing this to try and raise money so that she could get her son back. Unfortunately, her son died before she could succeed. The book didn't actually sell very well at the time because it dealt with some very uncomfortable truths, namely that the conditions that African Americans in the North had to put up with while not enslaved. They were not very well treated, and especially abolitionists, they were more focused on getting rid of the institution of slavery, and so they didn't want to pay attention to what African Americans up in the North were having to deal with. And so it was not a popular narrative to be talking about at the time. Now, after her son's death, she actually moves to Boston and becomes heavily involved in the spiritualist movement. So the spiritualist movement, for those who are not aware, it arises after the Civil War primarily, and kind of is a natural reaction to the amount of death and destruction and loss that families are experiencing. And it's essentially a religious and social movement that prioritizes the sort of communion and talking with spirits in order to further certain social goals as well. It's very, very interesting. And so Harriet Wilson actually worked as a medium, channeling messages from spirit guides and providing lectures in the Boston area and New England in general. She was well connected within those organizations and does manage to find some success there. Over time, she progresses to working as a clairvoyant physician and as a nurse, even selling her personal recipe for hair ointment, and even begins making house calls. And so this might be a clue into how she ends up in Quincy, which will make sense in a moment. In these years, she starts a spiritualist Sunday school for children, which only goes on for a few years, but does have some success. She ran a boarding house on Village Street in the South End at the same time as well. Now, in 1897, she moves to Quincy and is living with the Cobb family and is listed as working as a nurse. So it may have been, we can't find out much information about the Cobb family, but they may have been active in the spiritualist community. One of the family members may have had an ailment that she was treating, and so that might have been her connection to Quincy. But in 1900, she dies at Quincy City Hospital and ends up being buried in Cobb family plot, which is in Mount Wollaston. Now, fast forwarding to 1982, Henry Louis Gates Jr., the very famous historian, completely by accident, wanders into a bookshop, finds her book, and realizes that this will revolutionize the understanding of literary history for African Americans. And he manages to prove that she was the first published African American author of a novel. Before then, you had had other books published, usually slave narratives, but apparently no other novelizations were published before her. On the right hand side of the screen, we have Elizabeth Ogilvy. She is also a novelist, also a writer, and very famous for stories that were set in coastal towns of Maine. She likes talking about that. She's kind of Stephen King, but a little bit more wholesome. So she grew up in Wollaston as well and graduated from North Quincy High, but never attended college, but was still a very prolific writer. Published her first novel in 1944, which was called High Tide at Noon, which you can see the film adaptation of that, or from the billing there on the right-hand side of the screen. She wrote 46 books in all, including an autobiography, and as I said, several of her books were adapted into movies. So all in all, she was a very successful author. And of course, we can't talk about Quincy women without talking about Ruth. So we're going to talk a little bit about actresses from Quincy. So we have, of course, Ruth Gordon. She grew up in the Wollaston neighborhood, graduated from Quincy High School in what is known as the worst graduating class of all time, and it produced such failures as Ruth Gordon herself and Howard Johnson, the founder of the Howard Johnson Company. Of course, I'm using the word failures sarcastically. She was extremely successful. She actually started first appearing in silent films in 1915, but also started making Broadway appearances. And she continued acting all the way up. At the age of 19, she acted all the way up into her late 80s. She was never without a role. However, she is best known for her role in Harold and Maude as the titular Maude, of course, and for her role in Rosemary's Baby as the mother-in-law, I believe. Which she actually won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for that performance. She was also in addition to being an actress, she was a prolific writer. She had a number of screenplays to her name, produced a number of other movies, as well as several nonfiction books. She wrote her own autobiography as well. So a very, very successful writer and actress. I'm going to grab some water, one moment. I've been talking for a while. Much better. All right, moving on to Lee Remick. So Lee Remick, of course, is also an actress, grew up in Quincy, and is the daughter of Frank Remick, the proprietor of the Remick's department store. I'm sure all of you already knew that. So she also started acting at a very young age, around 18, and some of her most memorable roles were in the movies Anatomy of a Murder, The Omen, Days of Wine and Roses, for which she was nominated for an Oscar, The Europeans, a number of others. She also was never without work. She was on both she and Ruth were always on television, on Broadway, in movies. They were always, always, always working. Her final role was in 1989, and she retired due to her failing health and unfortunately died soon after. And then last but not least, we have Clara Blendick. That is Auntie Em, in fact. Yes, Auntie Em is from Quincy. There you go. We learned something new today. Yes, so Clara Blendick, she was actually born in Hong Kong, believe it or not. Her father was a ship captain, and so he changed jobs or changed ships not long after she was born, and so the family ended up settling in Quincy, so she went through the Quincy public school system, and of course she is best known for her role as Auntie Em in The Wizard of Oz. Unfortunately, her career was nowhere near as successful as Ruth Gordon or Lee Remick. She kind of mostly was getting character actor parts or bit parts in things. Financially, she had a lot of struggle in her life, and health-wise, she always had a lot of struggle too. So she unfortunately had a very sad personal life, and ended up and died in 1962. So it's just kind of a very sad life, but obviously very beloved in her role as Auntie Em. And then the last individual that I want to highlight here is Celestine Dorch. She is a very accomplished artist, and she was also the first African-American teacher at Quincy Public Schools. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and her family moved to Boston in 1920 so that the family could be close to the daughters as they're going to college. Celestine attended Boston University to study art and really excelled there. She started early and frequently started winning prizes for her art abilities and had many of her pieces featured in curated shows, including a show that was entirely curated of her own work. In 1954, she applied for an art teacher position at the Central Junior High School, which was a new program that was being implemented for artistically gifted students. And the superintendent at the time chose Dorch based on her talents as an artist. And unfortunately, we don't have these paintings in our collections. I actually found these listed on Etsy, and they had already sold, so we could not receive them. So unfortunate, but I was able to at least get these copies of some of her paintings. So those were scenes from the Hudson Valley done in 1941. As a teacher, she was beloved by her students and went on to lead a class trip to Central America so that she could study, or so that they could study their art. She was very intrigued by especially Mexican folk art. And when Wayne Miller, the editor of our newsletter, put together an article about her, he started compiling remembrances about Celestine as a teacher and just received countless number of just praise and how beloved she was by the community. So that brings us to one of the other reasons why we are here tonight, which is to talk a little bit about what's going on next at Quincy Historical Society and what we're planning to do with all of these stories and all of these remarkable individuals that we've been uncovering and talking about tonight. So, as I'm sure you are all aware, because you seem to be interested in history as a group, that Quincy's 400th anniversary is coming up next year in 2025. So Quincy Historical Society has some big plans for that year. In addition to the lectures and projects that we already have ongoing. So this includes a refresh of our permanent exhibit. So we're going to be redoing the exhibit, bringing it up to date, putting in some new pictures, and being able to bring in some new stories, finding ways to tell the stories that we already have in our exhibit, but do so in different ways, bring in new information, bring in new individuals and that perhaps have not or need some more attention in the community. We also have an immigration project that has been long stalled, but we really want to get it done for the 400th, talking about the sort of classic period of immigration, so starting in the early to mid 1800s and going up until about 1925, and talking about the various immigrant groups that came to Quincy and where they settled and why they came here, and exploring a little bit more into that, because that is history that has not been done yet. And then it is also the 100th anniversary of the Howard Johnson's Company. And so we are going to be writing a book about the history of Howard Johnson's. There are also a number of city projects going on. We know that it was announced that there's going to be an expanded signage campaign around the city at historic landmarks, so that as you're going around, people can find out more about the history in your own backyard with that, and they'll be having a number of events as well. So how can you help? Honestly, what we really need a lot of the time is photographs. We love photographs. Especially if a family member of yours owned a business in Quincy and you have photographs of that shop, or people or some event that was going on in Quincy. We love photographs, especially if you know who's in them. This makes our job a lot easier. So if you are going through your old photos and would like to even just give us a digital copy, we would be much obliged. Because this is a huge part of what we do is gathering these photos, and we can't do that without donations of them. Journals are also, primary sources like that are also priceless. We don't have many, and people often don't think, well, my grandmother wasn't anybody important. The Historical Society is not going to be interested in that. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. We're also interested in family stories. So if you know of individuals, for example, significant individuals in your own family's history or that you know of that you haven't heard us talk about, give us a call, let us know so that, if we haven't heard about it, we can start following up and learning more. And then also the best way to really support us and to help us continue this work is to become a member. It really is through our membership that we are able to do what we do, and I can have a job that I could do these wonderful presentations. So thank you to everybody who already is a member, and please continue to be one. And for anybody who isn't, please consider becoming one. It's only $25 a year. We're pretty cool. You clearly want to support us. And I just want to finish tonight by, this presentation mainly focuses on individual women that have had a remarkable history and really stand out in certain ways. However, none of those women did it alone. They relied on their networks. They relied on their communities for support. And so I just want to take a moment to recognize the women whose names don't get recorded in history very much. These are the mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, daughters, teachers, mentors, domestic workers, just the people in the community who have made Quincy what it is today and really support it and keep it going. And these are the people that make it so that these remarkable individuals can thrive, and that going forward into tomorrow, into the future, this is why Quincy is really remarkable, because we have a community that really does care about itself and about its history. So thank you, everyone.